Cardia meeting. The meeting is being recorded. If you have any objections to that, let us know. Welcome to the Cardia Users Group. We operate under the Linux Foundation umbrella of Linux Foundation Public Health and the Linux Foundation Antitrust Policy. I will provide a link in the minutes if you want to go read the detailed stuff there. Basically, we can't discuss anything around pricing or markets, go-to-market strategies of particular businesses. What we're trying to do here is provide an interoperable ecosystem that allows for the broad interoperability across the globe of the sharing of health status credentials in a way that's privacy preserving. Our code of conduct is linked in here to our repo where it's recorded. I will summarize it for you briefly. Be nice to others. Everyone is welcome. Listen to other people's opinions and try to be respectful of all persons participating. It's an open meeting. No membership is required. We record the meetings for people to be able to watch later. Any questions or comments so far? Would anyone like to introduce themselves that hasn't done it so recently? I will let the.
Well, Ken, I'll just jump in. Just for those who may not recognize some of the names under some of the, or pictures under some of the participants, there's a group of us who are partnering with Indicio to help to the extent that we can, or that maybe, we have some abilities, we can help build out some of this functionality in Cardia. And so the company's name is Networks Solutions, and there are people located in Kazakhstan and in St. Petersburg in Russia. And so my function is basically to act as a translator for them as much as I can.
Welcome everyone who is trying to support and build out the Cardia ecosystem. Welcome to Network Solutions. And our partners who would prefer to have this meeting be held in Russian. Okay, let's get started. Today we're going to be talking a little bit more about verifiers in the Cardia ecosystem. Let's take a look at a Cardia. The notes, meeting notes are here. I will post them in the chat.
I've done that.
You've done that? Okay, good. I won't do that then. If we look at the Cardia ecosystem, one of the things about the ecosystem is that it attempts to address the critical need for health status credentials coming from a health enterprise agent to be issued to a traveler or a holder of those credentials, to be presented to a government agent, and hopefully receive a trusted traveler credential if the contents of the credential are satisfactory to prove that you're safe to travel. We want to talk a little bit about the various other agents. There are a host of verifiers.
Сегодня более-менее технически еще, как они объяснили на прошлой неделе, они хотели бы показать то, что которые они делают.
I went ahead and muted him. Go ahead.
Okay. Basically, there are a number of parties that can act as verifiers in the ecosystem. Beyond just the government, there's airlines, immigration officials, hospitality, businesses, and different organizations might choose different types of verifiers. In the Cardia ecosystem, there are two main classes of verifiers that we've identified: those that are enterprise or hooked in cloud hosted type of agents, and those that are mobile. The mobile agents are more flexible in their deployment and easy to move about. The enterprise agents are targeted more for integrated systems that want to tie into existing systems or provide a more cloud and scalable mechanism for dealing with verifications. Mike and James are going to present some information about the verifiers in the system and give us a little bit more of a detailed look at them. They're not quite as, they're the tail end of the process, but Mike, you want to take over and share your screen? And
absolutely. Okay. Today I learned to make the screen size, the font size big enough. I remembered. So we're going to start with some extreme basics and then move towards slightly more complicated stuff. And then we'll share some reference code and examples. So it's basically a quick overview of why verifiers. If you think about it, your student ID or your Blockbuster card, especially your Blockbuster card these days, don't really do you a lot of good. And the question is, why not? Why can't I go and get some cool benefits from having a Blockbuster card? Decentralized identity is often depicted as a triangle. We have issuers, holders, and verifiers. And a good analogy is that, like a three-legged stool, if you were missing one of those three, then the ecosystem falls down. So you wouldn't have credentials if there were no issuers. Those credentials could not be secure or portable or shared if you didn't have a holder. And your credentials and assertions of claims wouldn't be useful if there was no one to verify whether you had them or not, and whether they accept it, whether there's something conditional that they will or won't do for you, depending on your credentials. So there are, in this early stage of decentralized identity around the world, there are situations where people have built issuers and they've built holders, but there's no one out there verifying the credentials. And so, if you hold a Blockbuster card, there used to be an issuer, and now you hold the credential of having a Blockbuster card, but there's no one out there to verify or provide any benefit for having that credential, and that can be a problem with other decentralized identity systems. And so that's one thing that we've learned at NDCO, is that in order to have successful proofs of concept, trials, and live projects, it's good to nurture all three parts of that ecosystem as you build things. So how do verifiers work? What is the benefit? How do they verify these claims in order to provide benefits? So generally, there are just three steps. The verifier requests a presentation. The holder offers the data that they have as attributes, predicates, and even as multi-credential proofs using reference. So an attribute is something like, say, someone's name or date of birth, or user ID or email address, some statement of information that can be verified as either true or false. A predicate allows you to do a statement that's a range or a set. Say, is this person over 21? I don't need to know exactly their age, but are they old enough? Or I don't really care which state they were born in, as long as they're a citizen of the following countries, things like that. And then reference, you can make presentations that use multiple credentials, and the presentation request could say, I need the date of birth and then first and last name from the passport, and I need the ID number from something like a health pass, and I need the vaccine test result from a test credential, and combine them into a proof that has multiple sources of information, and rely on the most appropriate credential for each source of information. Let me go ahead and share the link to this document, so it can be posted in the notes. Let's see.
I was going to ask you for that.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mike.
So we have some references here to the RFCs for how an Aries and Hyperledger present proof workflow works, and some recommendations for best practices. So any questions so far on why you would need a verifier or some of the basics of how they work? Okay, we'll continue. So we spoke a couple weeks ago about machine readable governance, and a verifier is a case where maybe perhaps even more than the other roles in a verifiable credential ecosystem, governance is really important. The verifiers really could use a hand in finding out which issuers are allowed to issue credentials, or what the rules are for how to proceed with a particular credential. So the COVID example is really common lately. And so the question is, how good are a particular set of tests or a vaccine? How many doses of the vaccine are needed? Which organizations are valid issuers of a driver's license? In the United States, you would initially think maybe just a list of the U.S. states, but there could be other sources of driver's license, like certain foreign governments' licenses may be accepted, or temporary learning permits from some driving schools might be acceptable. And so, things change, and new organizations crop up, new guidelines are issued. So having machine readable governance where the verifier can look up the present batch of rules and implement those in its verifications and presentation groups would be really useful. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice a little bit. There are, broadly two main categories of verifiers that theoretically could be written. You can start with specialized, lightweight, focused verifiers. So for example, the Cardia verifier is currently built to verify credentials based on, a single schema based on the trusted traveler. And when your verifier is lightweight and simple like this, it's can be pretty quick to set up some rules, change some branding, and reissue another version of the verifier that's tailored to a specific use case. So this would be so for example, if no one wants to verify anything other than a trusted traveler at the door, health pass, then that's a pretty focused application. But most people like to have, most governments or airlines, most companies would like to have their logo on it. So having an open source verifier that you can swap some logos on and then deploy to use a single credential is pretty quick. We're also working towards making it so that verifiers could be more broad in their implementation, more general. So if you, as you add protocols, ledgers where the data is stored that can be verified, and the ability to adjust to the data formats and attributes of multiple schemas, then you can get closer to a universal verifier. And a universal verifier would be especially useful in cases where flexibility is important. Travel is a good example. So for example, some countries may require specific vaccinations in order for you to travel, or you may need to configure insurance requirements based on where you live, or you could do something like certain purchases require different credentials, like you're registering to buy a firearm, or certain places marijuana is legal and others it's not, and the legal drinking age is different depending on where you go, and all of those can need to work on different sets of credentials. An education setting may have all sorts of different credentials that it needs to work with, some for its students, and some for its staff, and some for its faculty, and so having a verifier that you could deploy in that scenario that can be flexible to use with more than just a single use case may be useful. All right, so now we'll talk about some sample implementations. We have Cardia mobile verifier that we're working on deploying as a reference implementation that everyone can use to work with the trusted traveler credential. We're also working on deploying the government enterprise agent, and its main role is as an issuer of a trusted traveler, but it has code for verifying test results in it. And then finally, we're working on also open sourcing the code for an enterprise verifier that would allow for an interface something like this. So I've just got a generic logo for a sample restaurant on here, and it could do something as simple as showing the QR code and then some simple messages depending on the verification status. So I have a holder on my phone here that I'm going to pull up. We'll scan this QR code, and it should change the message depending on whether I'm verified or not with this Cardia situation. So it's verifying that I have a trusted traveler card. I'm going to send those credentials now, and all it has to do is say, "Yep, you're verified." And you can deploy something simple like this web-based screen almost anywhere, and not have it not depend on a mobile app, where you could integrate more complicated logic beyond just a thumbs up, thumbs down, but have it based on an enterprise or web-based code platform. James, have you got some agents that you want to show us?
Before we get to James' demo, Mike, you've mentioned that there is a single schema reliance on the verifier. That's a single schema. That's the trusted traveler that you're looking at for the single schema verifier that's at the very end of the chain. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes.
Okay, and then you mentioned also that the government agent in the Cardia ecosystem is a verifier, but it is not verifying the trusted traveler. It's the issuer on the trusted traveler, and it's verifying. Its job of verification is slightly more complex because it has to deal with the medical health status credentials, which might be of more than one schema type.
That's true. The Cardia implementation of a government agent will eventually have to verify. I can think of at least 3 credentials. They would have to verify test results with 2 different sets of rules for test results. So a positive COVID test would need to be old enough that the person was recovered, and that would excuse me, that would indicate that they are at least for some number of months not going to spread COVID. A negative test needs to be recent enough that there's no risk that the person has already contracted COVID. You have to offer the ability to verify at least one kind of vaccine for COVID tests. And then others' health statuses could be, it may be important to offer an exception or an exemption type credential that says there's some other way that's not in this batch of known uses that says that the person is safe or allowed to travel, something like that. So that's at least 3 credential types that the government would have to deal with in order to verify health status and issue the trusted traveler.
Is there any limitation on the enterprise or the government agent in using this to, for instance, for yellow fever?
So we do need to work on making the code more robust at easily handling multiple schemas or different types of credentials or something like that. There's some places where, unfortunately, in the interest of time, we had to hard code things for trusted traveler or test result schemas. But you know, with a little coding elbow grease, or as we work on making the system able to handle more generic types of stuff, there's not really a reason why you couldn't use the system to do more than just COVID. You could do yellow fever, you could do, you know, you could do tetanus shots, you could do school immunization records where something as boring as a chicken pox or a flu vaccine would be something that would be useful to verify. You could do something that says, you could have scout camp requiring a credential for having a physical exam and have it be something that would be in a particular context important to whether a Boy Scout or a student could travel. Say you could checked out by a doctor. So yeah, the system could be flexible enough to do more than just COVID.
Those would be extensions beyond its current initial MVP kind of target.
Exactly.
But I think to piggyback on that thought, Ken, part of our work in our schema design was specifically to make it generic enough so that our base schema, which we'll talk about more next week, is going to be transferable beyond the COVID pandemic. And then also it's really just in the governance that would be manipulated. Is that correct?
I think that lines up pretty closely. Yeah, that the schemas are broader than just a COVID test result. They're a test result schema, so that if there's a test for tuberculosis, for instance, it could also be able to be sustained by the schema that we're using. So even though
Same with vaccine.
Yeah, same with
Yes.
vaccines. The idea is to make the schemas flexible enough and broad enough that the same attributes can be used to represent multiple health concerns. And so that reduces the complexity of the system by using shared schemas with slightly different attribute values to represent the different possibilities. But a lot of that is buried, like Keela mentioned and Mike, in the governance, and can be set up by any particular country to match their own particular regulations or health directives that they have in place.
Also, we have a question from Steve. Steve, do you want to ask your question or do you want me to read it? I don't know if you can come off mute.
Yeah, after I wrote it, I'm rethinking it, right? It's just more of a general, I guess, kind of a concept of, you know, how much information should the verifier be relying on what the issuer is providing? So you gave some examples, like, you know, if we're talking about a driver's license, that I might, you know, that it's, you know, all the states in the United States, and that's fine. But if I take this outside the United States, now I have to have some information to be provided that it's a legitimate license and I should accept it and so forth. And so I guess maybe the broad way of stating that is, in terms of use cases, how core of a use case do you see the system in providing information to a verifier to consume in real time, as opposed to, you know, knowing this information through some other channels outside, and they would set up in advance, and so when it arrives, they already know to accept it, as opposed to having to process the rules in real time?
There's some combination of that can occur. One of the reasons that the government agents set up to issue a trusted traveler is that the interactions can occur prior to departure, so that they can be taken care of ahead of time, and then the trusted traveler issued to facilitate both the travel and arrival experiences and the post-arrival experiences beyond the airport when they arrive. That gives a little bit of flexibility there. There is some tension between pre-processing and dynamic rule changes. And so some processing is better done in real time. Some is within a certain time window acceptable to do prior to its immediate consumption need. I think the trusted traveler mechanism of taking the complexity of an interaction and being able to pre-process it is a great idea to facilitate that type of interaction. The other thing that I think you touched on is as GCCN, the Global COVID Credential Network, is looking to try to satisfy is how does governance work to determine easy access. So for instance, if I'm a government, I'm the government of India, and I want to look at trust, who can I trust in the United States? Is it possible to lean on some of the governance rules that the United States has put in place to describe things inside of its own jurisdiction? Or how do I know, as the government of Canada, to trust a traveler coming from Mexico, for instance? How do I know what labs, what pharmacies can be trusted as issuers of valid vaccination credentials? If part of it can be scoped within the geography of the jurisdiction of a particular government, and then that other outside parties, if they trust that government to do a good job, then they can rely on and lean on the definitions of who the trusted travelers are, what the trusted issuers are, what are acceptable schemas, and so forth. And that allows for that, some of that to happen. And that's part of the discussion of, as we take the Cardia ecosystem and the governance that we have that describes a single government or use case, how do you publish that information in a way that's shareable? How do you extract that information from a shared registry or a registry of links to other governance documents, so that I can pull those things out, do the types of calculations I need to do. Some of them I could do in advance, some of them I might need to do in more or less in real time, but it helps facilitate that discussion and as we kind of mature the ecosystem.
Jeff also has a question, which is, and I'll read this and take responding to it, which is, given that I'm quoting his message in our chat here, given how poorly the US has rolled out documentation for vaccinations, for example, generally no secure documentation exists, or maybe electronic is the right word to use there, how would this system back integrate for data on previously vaccinated people? So I can answer that. There are a series of options available to us. The most centralized, which is still very decentralized, is what are called immunization registries. So each health department in the United States has an immunization registry that is generally run by the Department of Health for that region, whether that's a state, or there are some instances where cities have immunization registries. And those have the immunization records for individuals. For children, and this might vary state by state, but for children, it's usually mandated reporting. Adult vaccinations is optional reporting, so that's where like yellow fever might be harder to get into to make sure is there. But COVID was considered mandated reporting. So along with the little index card that we got, which we've like in plastic and sealed for safekeeping, there are electronic records that are available and could be used to issue these credentials from trustworthy sources. And there's a couple of on-ramps to be able to get to that data. So hopefully that answers your question, Jeff. You can let me know if it doesn't.
Yeah, that's great, Sheila. Keela, thank you. I wasn't aware that registry existed. And then the question is, if you have a travel pass or you have some kind of open product, so how do you access all that? And then, so you have to be somehow trusted by the government. So this comes back to, or the ministry or that particular state's registries. So this becomes back to, is the entity who's got the health or travel pass a trusted partner to the state? And so I'll take that offline with you, but I can see where this creates a series of interesting discussions.
Yes, and I am well steeped in that. So if you do have any other questions, I'm happy to dig into it offline, or we can bring it back to a future meeting.
Generally speaking, sorry, go ahead, Ken.
Across borders, and so Canada may do it differently than the United States, who does it differently than the EU, who does it differently than Australia.
Yeah, and it would be interesting, Ken, maybe we can get some health people to talk about those different, like a global summary. That would be fun.
That would be fun.
I'll put it on our
Sure, I don't know.
agendas.
I don't know who I cut off. I apologize.
I think it was
That's,
Mike.
yeah, that's Mike. Just trying to pitch in something about general, the general use case for as the world adopts decentralized identity credentials and digital credentials. There's a whole slew of paper credentials that, or physical or other forms of credentials that will need to make the leap or the transition. And so there will need to be issuing organizations that say, I am sufficiently expert in recognizing this particular set of offline or other form paper or other form of electronic credentials. I sufficiently understand them that I can tell when one is real and one is fake. And as an issuer, I will offer people the option to present to me their alternative form of credential, and then I can issue them a digital one where I'm willing to assert the claims that that credential was in a form that I trusted or was verified in alternate means, and then I'll provide the digital mechanism for offering, using that credential in other places. So, for example, a DMV or a student body or a school could say, I recognize the paper or plastic driver's license or the diploma that was printed 10 years ago or whatever, and I'm willing to offer a digital version now and assert those claims to verifiers out there that this was accurate and true.
I think, Mike, I'll add that, or amplify what you said, that really, those sort of secondary issuers, the governance piece of that for the verifier is really critical to know that if I'm getting, let's say, a vaccine credential that was issued by a university because they looked at my physical card, the verifier needs to understand that vaccination attribute isn't coming necessarily directly from the healthcare provider. It's coming from the university who, has done whatever KYC work they've done to verify that my paper was correct and accurate. So there's some trust work involved there.
Yeah, and you could see, sorry to derail this a little bit, but you could almost see, you have, if you want a mortgage in the US, they do employment verification, right? And they actually make phone calls and they check with people and they say, do you know this person? Did they work for you, et cetera? You could almost see that there's going to be a need for that in whatever digital credential we're going to need moving forward. That there's some broker that does the lift, the legwork to verify it, even if it's manually.
Right. If there's a what I sort of call, and I don't know this is the correct term, but secondary issuers, meaning you're not the original source of that data, but you've done some KYC work to make yourself happy that data is accurate. And then for verifiers to trust it, they need to know what your workflow was, what KYC work did you do, and whether that's, one-to-one communication between stakeholders, verifiers, and issuers, or whether there's some publicly available, published knowledge base to say, University of Maryland did this work on all of our COVID cards, and therefore this is what went into our digital COVID credential. So
it's one of the most exciting things that we see with technology is that you establish a simple set of core rules, and then all of a sudden you start seeing amazing ad hoc and emergent behavior. And in this case, if it's based on secure, privacy preserving credentials, then you get those awesome benefits and emergent behaviors while also helping protect people's data. So the internet has exploded, but people are being tracked, every single thing they do practically, and that's a negative outcome of some emergent behavior providing that personal data online. But if you suddenly are protecting that with credentials and cryptography and things like that, then you can get some of those emergent behaviors without endangering people's data, at least not so much. And so that we could see some really exciting applications due to some second party emergent verifications that can happen.
Excellent. Mike, I think we're back to you on the originally scheduled programming.
No, this is exactly the kind of discussion I was hoping would happen as we went through this. So I was just about to check with James to see if we have some of the Cardia agents that are being migrated. Are there any of them that are ready to share, James?
I apologize. My voice is also an octave or two lower currently. Ken did ask me to share the Cardia mobile verifier and go through some of that.
All right, I've stopped screen sharing so you can do it.
All right, and can you see my screen?
Yes,
Yes.
looks good.
Awesome. So I've gone ahead and set up the holder, and but primarily wanted to focus on the verifier in this case. So going to go through the registration steps on the verifier and go through the verification process. The registration itself is pretty simple. We have this locked to pin similar to the holder. Then we ask for name, and this is what will be presented to the holder at time of presentation. In this case, I'm just going to put Indicio. Then at this point, we are able now at the verify screen, if we then tap verify, we can display a QR code to the holder. And we can see the settings, which are pretty minimal for the verifier. At this point, I'm going to scan the QR code with the holder. And that is connecting, and now the verifier is requesting that credential, and I will approve that request on the holder. Then the verifier will identify if that meets its needs, and will display the relevant information to the end user here, giving some information about who the issuer was, some identifying information to help prevent subsequent or multiple people utilizing a single phone. There are some interesting ideas we have there that I could talk about for a second, actually. And as well as when was this card created, what's their trusted time. So if this was a year ago, that may be relevant to the current use case that this is being used in. If we go to the history, we can identify, we get a list of our verifications, so we can see who was verified and when. And so the verifier is pretty simple. That's about what we have on the demo front. Questions on the demo?
James, I have a question.
Yes.
This history, is this getting fed back anywhere? Like if they were trying to track, if they needed to go back and mine the data, or something happens with this traveler ID and turns out they tested positive, the next morning, where does this go potentially?
Currently, this is just stored on device, but I think this is something that we will need to do in the future, is to compile that information to a single place. One of the things that we can do here is essentially have a enterprise agent that is the verifying organization, and they have multiple mobile applications. Sorry, I should say they can have multiple employees with credentials that allow them to use the verifier app. So it starts getting to be a more complicated system, but that does allow for you to centralize that data.
When you say centralize, you're centralizing it with the verifier organization. You're not talking about centralizing it back to the government or anything like that.
Correct. That's a very good clarification.
There's a possibility with using identity escrow to issue one-time use DIDs that can be pulled out of escrow if the terms of escrow are met. For instance, there's an outbreak and you need to re-identify a small sub portion of all the data. Then you can use that to notify organizations that do verification of exposure events or things like that. But the identity is and privacy are preserved, but it allows for notifications to occur without the correlation problems that occur with just using a normal DID for those tracking purposes. So you have to trust an escrow service, an independent escrow service, to shield that data from incorrect use or tracking or monitoring. But there is a mechanism that is potential for an enhancement to the Cardia ecosystem to allow for contact tracing in the event that there is a person who is later identified as having COVID, even though they had the vaccination, even though they had a PCR test or whatever, that if for any reason they are later found to be ill, then they can use the identity escrow service to de-escrow that person and find out where they have been to do more invasive contact tracing in the event of a health crisis.
It raises a question for me too, and maybe this is the time to ask it, right? If in the event, and this is maybe another scenario, right? If you think about a school, they have to maintain records, for example, of, that their population has been vaccinated or whatever their requirements may be. Does that mean that when they verify, they're going to do a more robust in that scenario data capture and then store it? And that's the agreement that the holder has with the verifiers, that they're letting them basically keep that data?
There's varying degrees of requirements for organizations. Restaurants really don't need to keep and persist data beyond 2 weeks or whatever an exposure period might be. Organizations like governments and perhaps schools or places where you're residing, a hospital may need some additional information displayed to them. A trusted traveler may not be sufficient credential for that type of verifier. You may need additional things more like the government agent for a school or for an organization that needs to track those health records more directly instead of relying on a government to say, yeah, they're a happy trusted traveler. That's sufficient for you. In some cases, they might need to present, instead of the trusted traveler, you could present a trusted traveler and more detailed health information that might need to be recorded in certain cases. But those can be handled as the need arises, because once the credentials are there, the health status credentials and the trusted traveler credentials, they can be used in combination or independently as much as the need requires. And the guidelines in an ecosystem can outline who's allowed to ask for more detailed health information. Well, maybe schools are, but restaurants shouldn't be, or the auto repair shop definitely doesn't need to see any of my health records. But the places where more sensitivity, if I'm visiting a nursing home, maybe I need to have a little bit more sensitivity towards the health status for more stringent requirements than the normal trusted traveler would need. And those can be handled in a fairly flexible manner, but it does require updates to the governance framework.
So one thing of note here that I think is interesting on the verifier point, and may have some further discussion here, is the mechanism we have here for we've passed the traveler ID and we're displaying this to the end user that is verifying to help them minimize the phone being utilized for multiple people's. This is an interesting mechanism. My preferred solution here will be to say it's or one of the next steps here to me would be, oh, have I used have I been presented a trusted traveler with this ID in the past 10 minutes? Maybe display a warning to the verifier to be, validate that identity more so. I would be interested on the thoughts of the identity verification at point of verification. What some thoughts are there beyond that mechanism?
One of the thoughts I had was that we've got biometric tools within most mobile devices, and so there's the opportunity to, if I'm the traveler holding my app, to require a Face ID or a fingerprint or something like that, before the credential is presented. And that's still not going to eliminate perhaps me doing my Face ID and then immediately handing my phone to somebody, but it provides an extra hurdle to get through, and and then engage some sort of timeout function that's once the Face ID has happened, if things don't process, then it has to happen again before the next presentation.
So in the short term, I think we should not ignore the fact that most people already have documentation of some kind. And so it would be useful, for example, to say, hey, in addition to their trusted traveler pass, they need to present something, a driver's license or passport or something that actually has their name or maybe picture on it, in combination with this health credential. And that solves several problems all at the same time. And in the long term, no, that's not what we want the world to look like. In the short term, gosh, it's here and it works, and we don't have to, I don't think we have to over design the system to never require a digital credential again.
Yeah, using the existing non-digital credentials in conjunction with a digital credential offers some strength and flexibility to the system to allow for verification beyond that. You could also present a digital driver's license as well, but the part of our goal was to provide fairly loose coupling to meet the requirements without making the system overly complex or completely shedding all of the privacy protections that are built into the system. James, did you have other things that you wanted to share right away, or?
I guess a brief note on the repo itself, the migration here that should happen within today. Currently, this repo is private, but this is you should see this fairly shortly. So we'll likely post in the Cardia channel on Slack when that actually is made public. And a quick note on the code is the structure is very similar to the holder, with the primary interest being in the agent provider component and the workflow component. So I wanted to quickly note this is how we're constructing our proof request, and defining these are our requested attributes, and it is restricted to the specific schema. This currently isn't restricting it to a specific issuer, but this is where the format of what this is looking like from the verifier point of view. And happy to answer any additional questions on the mobile verifier, but that is what I had prepared.
So the code base for this is very similar to the code base for the holder, built on React or the Java.
Aries framework, JavaScript, and Aries 5 folder, correct.
So they share considerable amounts of code, so that if you're familiar with the holder code, you would be comfortable jumping in on the verifier code, on the mobile verifier at least.
Correct. And especially because the mobile verifier is much simpler in some of its portions than the holder. It doesn't have to do as many things. So one, it's easier to alter pieces and or for instance, rebranding is simpler because there's simply less screens to rebrand.
Excellent. How is this code related to the code on the enterprise verifier? Are do they share the same code, or what are their similarities? What are their differences?
I would say that first off, they're utilizing the same protocols, same format of requests. So they're essentially both conforming to the same standard of requesting of verifications. That's the primary piece. The second, I don't believe we don't have a governance framework backing them, but they both should be using a governance framework. As far as I know, the code is utilizing the enterprise verifier is utilizing Akapi, while the mobile is backed by Aries Framework JavaScript. But given their interoperability capabilities, they utilize the same protocols. I'll let Mike add anything of note on from his point of view.
Since they're both using JavaScript and the presentation requests and presentations, etc., would be in the same format. It's, you know, the data is transferred using JSON. If you're familiar with one, I imagine that I mean, we don't directly share code between the verifying agents, but since they follow, you know, as James said, all the same protocols and formats, it would very quickly be familiar and a workable solution for someone to look at both pieces of code. The enterprise verifier that I demonstrated is, you know, with a generic placeholder restaurant logo before, is built on the same code base as the enterprise issuers. It just has it has a lot of the interface hidden or turned off because it's not necessary. But those two code bases, you know, share virtually all of the code. And so if you're familiar with the enterprise issuer agents that we have, then the enterprise verifier will be a simplified version of that. And it would also facilitate quick understanding of the different parts of the ecosystem.
And if there was a question there, one clarification I would add is that the enterprise is utilizing Akapi, which is in Python, and the controller that we've written is in Node/JavaScript. So just an additional clarification there.
Okay, good point.
So the code bases that you're written on have interoperability testing using the Aries interop testing test harness and code to help ensure that the code bases remain interoperable, and then the unique portions are separate from that, built onto the top of those frameworks. Does that summarize it pretty well?
Correct. The Aries Framework JavaScript and Akapi share 100% interop capabilities, excluding revocation with the Aries Framework JavaScript.
So are there these code bases have a roadmap associated with them that was reviewed, and so ongoing work on enhancing both the primary functionality and some of the features that sit on top of that are an ongoing effort. The roadmap is that in the repo at this point in time, or has that been transferred to a place that people can look at what the roadmap contains and what people are going to be working on?
I don't believe that the roadmap is in the repos, but I would pass that off to Trevor. I believe Trevor was going to post that to the Cardia.app site.
Yep, I'm going to do that, seeing as there's no time to talk about it now. So yes, check in on the Cardia app in a couple of hours, and you can see the priority list will be there.
Okay, are there other questions for James or Mike before we wrap up for the day? Keela, do you have any foreshadowing you would like to do for next week's discussion?
Yeah, so given the discussion at our steering committee, which was, feels like a zillion years ago, but was just last week, we decided that we really need to settle on our schema before we can start building some other things like governance and some of those core foundational building blocks. So next week, we're going to do another compare and contrast on schemas and try to get consensus on settling on one if we can, which might be a large task, but that's our goal for next week.
So this would be an upgrade to the schemas that we've already settled on to try to either make adjustments to the one that we're doing or adopt one that's more interoperable with other ecosystems. But it's not a radical departure from where we are today.
Agreed. And we've done that discussion. So we've a couple of weeks ago at this meeting talked through those schemas in excruciating detail. So I'm hopeful that we'll be able to get some consensus. And given the discussion today about making this live longer than COVID, to keep that in mind as we review those schemas so that it really can be transferable to the future.
Excellent. Look forward to meeting with everyone next week. Same bat channel, same bat time. See if we can push forward our work on the schemas and provide a more interoperable ecosystem that's easier for other people to work with the Cardia credentials and for Cardia to accept credentials from people who have already started creating their own based on other schemas. Thanks today to Mike and James for presenting on the verifier bits. Look forward to having those in the repos as soon as possible. And happy 4th of July for those of you that are in the United States, and happy normal weekend for the rest of you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for your time. Thank you.